May 2018. Palestinians and Israelis mark 70 years of conflict in the Middle East. Israelis celebrating the opening of the US Embassy in Jerusalem.
What a glorious day. Remember this moment.
Palestinians running for their lives. Protesting against the Israeli blockade on Gaza, which has made their lives unbearable. In 2 months, more than 100 Palestinians were killed by Israeli snipers. Children, paramedics, journalists.
These people were shot in the back, in the head and limbs with live ammunition.
Israel blamed Hamas.
The Hamas terrorist organization have sent their women and their children as a ploy to hide their true intentions.
The Israelis, however, seem to see the Palestinians as a sideshow.
And here's what we got.
They're much more obsessed with getting the world to focus on the supposed threat from Iran.
Iran lied.
I'm Mehdi Hasan, and I've come here to the Oxford Union to go head-to-head with Danny Ayalon, who served as Israel's Deputy Foreign Minister, Ambassador to the United States, and advisor to Prime Ministers Sharon, Barak, and Netanyahu. I'll challenge him on whether Israel's shooting of Palestinian protesters is moral or legal, and I'll ask him not only about Iran's nuclear program, but Israel's own nuclear weapons. Tonight, I'll also be joined by Professor Avi Shleim, the renowned Israeli-British historian, Paul Charney, chairman of the UK Zionist Federation, and Diana Boutou, the Palestinian lawyer and former advisor to the PLO. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Danny Ayalon. Currently, he heads the Truth About Israel, a Zionist advocacy organization. Thank you for coming. Pleasure. And thank you very much. Danny Ayalon, on May 14th of this year, the Israeli government celebrated the 70th anniversary of your country's independence at the opening of the new US Embassy in Jerusalem. I believe you were there as well at that event. While over in Gaza, on that same day, Israeli army snipers killed 62 Palestinians in cold blood, gunned them down in full view of the world's television cameras. How do you justify, can you justify, the killing of unarmed Palestinian protesters, journalists, paramedics, kids?
Well, Mehdi, no one can justify killing innocent people, but I'm not sure this was the case. The 14th of May, you're right, 62 persons were killed. They were pushed by their leaders of the Hamas, who, by the way, want to destroy the state of Israel. They were using them as human shields, as some of them were behind them with bombs, incendiary, Molotov, and other things. By the way, the 62, Hamas itself confessed the second day that out of the 62, 50 were active Hamas members. All the rest, we call it in a way which I don't like, collateral damage. But we have to look at who is responsible for the death. And the responsible is only Hamas.
Here's a question to you. 143 Palestinians at least, and the count keeps changing because Israelis keep killing more, have died since March the 30th, since the beginning of the so-called Great March of Return. 15,000 Palestinians, let's just be clear, 15,000 have been wounded. 4,000 of them, according to the United Nations, were shot with live ammunition. Are you telling the Oxford Union audience here, the audience at home, that those 15,000 people were all members of Hamas? Seriously?
Mehdi, I can look at anyone here in their eyes and say, Israel is doing its level best not to kill anyone who is not involved. It's very important to know who is responsible here, because...
Is it not the responsibility of the people pulling the trigger? That's normally how you hold people responsible for someone being killed.
Well, how do you define pulling the trigger? If you have the Hamas people...
A man with a gun aims at a child from 150 meters away and shoots him in the head.
What about Palestinian terrorists who are hiding behind innocent people, who are launching rockets?
Well, it's a simple question. 15,000 wounded. How many of them were either members of Hamas/terrorists?
I do not know. I know that from the 62 on the 14th of May, 50 were Hamas by their own admission.
No, we don't know that because there hasn't been an investigation.
The facts are...
You got their Hamas membership forms from their bodies? What's the facts?
The facts are that Hamas leadership, sometimes at gunpoint, are sending those poor Hamas, those poor Gazan people to the borders. Now,
where's
what
the evidence
business
for
do
that?
they have in the borders?
The UN doesn't say that. Human rights groups don't say that.
Well,
let's
they're
come back
not
to the issue
free.
of the shootings here. Even if they were all members of Hamas, even if all 15,000 people are, you do realize that under international law and basic morality, you can't shoot people for being members of a group, no matter what group it is. You can only shoot them when they pose an imminent threat to you. Were 15,000 people posing an imminent threat to Israeli snipers?
Yes, they were. Yes, they were. And I'll tell you how. I'll tell you how. First of all, not to the Israeli snipers, but certainly to the Israeli kids and babies and women and men who live in their own territory. Hamas is sending their people. It's not just demonstration.
Countless Palestinians at the protests have been interviewed and they said we weren't sent by Hamas.
Just go into the
But they're all liars, are they?
Just go into the blogs of Hamas, where they say the Jews are sons of pigs and sons of dogs.
And you're now quoting them as a reliable source. That's my favorite. I've interviewed so many Israelis. You're the first to come here and say, my source is Hamas.
Of course it is.
In 10 years of doing this.
Of course it is.
Wow.
Because all you have to do is to see what they say.
Well, no, how about we look at some facts rather than your kind of dodgy blogs? Let me ask you this. What threat did Razan al-Najjar, 21-year-old volunteer paramedic, who was shot while wearing a white uniform in the chest 100 meters away from the fence, what threat did she pose to Israeli snipers?
Wait a minute. This is something I really looked into.
Okay. I'm glad someone did.
Yes. She was having an incendiary bomb, and there is an investigation by the IDF, so she was a threat. But I have another question for you.
Where's your...
Why,
Hold on,
why was she going into
you know why she was going?
zone?
Because you're killing her people and she's a paramedic.
No.
Can you tell me how many Israelis were killed by Palestinian protesters since March the 30th?
You know,
simple
again,
question.
I didn't check it, but you know
Zero.
Why
but you're
is
the
it,
ones under threat.
No. I want to ask, why is it that no Israeli was killed? Because the Israeli government, elected democratically, is defending them. Hamas people, not defending their people.
Palestinians don't get a right to self-defense,
No, they are sending them to die. They
themselves.
are sending them to die. It's a culture of death.
Really, you keep saying they were sent to their death, as if Israelis have no agency. You were forced to pull the trigger. You just shot them because Hamas whispered in your ears to shoot them. You could choose not to kill people at a fence who are just damaging a fence, allegedly, as the UN, the EU, international lawyers have said. No other country shoots people in this way, in the back as they're running away.
Mehdi, I'm sorry if I show some impatience, but it's not a human rights situation. It's an area in conflict. It's an armed conflict.
I see. So in war zones, there's no human rights. You can do whatever you want.
Well,
is that what Israel's position is?
There is laws
shoot people
of
in the
law.
back, shoot nurses, shoot kids.
Listen.
Shoot journalists.
I'll ask you. You have our border. You have thousands of people stampeding over to your borders with knives in their hands, with bombs, and you know that you have kindergartens,
journalists
schools,
and eyewitnesses say there were
people.
not thousands of people with bombs. That is a false statement, Danny, and you know it.
Out of these thousands, it's enough that one has a bomb.
Okay,
but
so I'm glad you've gone from thousands to one.
But no,
we're getting somewhere.
No, you're putting words in my mouth.
I'm putting your own words in your own mouth.
No,
you said
you're
thousands
not.
went with knives.
No.
I'm saying that's not true. Do you stand by that statement? Do you stand by that statement?
You know what? I said something else. I said, even if there was one, there were 1,000, but even if there was one, I say you are wrong.
You say this 21-year-old nurse, Razan al-Jadar, had a bomb. No evidence of that. Eyewitnesses say not true.
It is still under investigation.
There's videos of her holding her hands up. Let me ask you this. Yasser Murtaja, journalist, 30 years old, shot in the stomach by an Israeli sniper. He was 250 meters away from the fence. Why was he? What knife did he carry? What knife was he carrying?
You can quote hundreds of names. If you look at them individually, I feel bad for them and for their families, even if they were coming to harm us.
I'm asking, how do you justify
killing? Because they came with a harm intention. If they were
Where's your proof of that? Yasser al-Murtaja was not Hamas, was a journalist. You shot him in the stomach. Your country shot him in the stomach. And you claim he had a hurtful intention. That's an outrageous claim to make someone who was dead without any evidence. That's literally smearing the dead.
Anyone who goes into a war zone knows exactly what he's doing.
What is a war zone?
When they come and attack us, it's a war zone.
He wasn't attacking you. If you pull a gun, you aim at someone, you shoot them. Remember, the Israeli military bragged on Twitter, we know where every bullet landed.
Mehdi, you go around the circle to the same point. And the point is that we have a border.
You don't have a
legitimate border.
You don't have a border,
Danny. They try
Danny.
to cross it.
Danny,
not
Gaza
with flowers,
is occupied territory.
Not with candies,
this nonsense that you have a border is absurd. Gaza is occupied territory. The people there are living in an open-air prison camp, and you're saying it's a border.
I beg to differ. Gaza is not occupied territory.
You beg to differ with the United Nations, the European Union, the International Criminal Court, every Western government. The International Committee for the Red Cross says Gaza is being treated with collective punishment. That's the view of the ICRC. Can I ask a question? Does Israel control Gaza's borders, airspace, and territorial waters? Yes or no?
No. No.
Really?
Israel, no.
Wow.
Because
you're
I'll
just
tell
going to
you.
come here and say barefaced falsehood.
No, the things
So
are not
fishermen who
yes
go beyond
and no.
6 miles and get
Listen.
shot, they just imagine the bullets hitting them.
Listen, the blockade is because
Didn't actually ask about the blockade, but I'm glad you brought that up.
Hamas
The World Bank says you're strangling Palestinian territories with the blockade.
Is killing and want to kill us, and they say we want to blot Israel off the map. We don't want any Jews there, and this is the main problem.
Your former boss, Avigdor Lieberman, Israel's current defense minister, founder of your party.
You raise now a touchy issue.
Okay.
I would
well, he's the defense.
Refer to me as my former boss.
He is your former boss. He's also the current defense minister.
I'm not in the party anymore.
Okay.
Independent. Please let it be recorded.
He said, quote, "There are no innocent people in the Gaza Strip to justify the killings." Do you support that statement?
Listen, I'm not in the government. I do not support Lieberman. I do not support many things he says. I don't think that there are not innocent people in Gaza. There are, but they are subject to the terror of Hamas. And they are sending them into the border.
And when General Zvika Vogel, former head of Southern Command, said in April, if a child or anyone else gets close to the fence, his punishment is death. Do you support that death penalty for anyone who comes near a fence?
I don't agree to that, except if he is holding a weapon.
Mohammed Ibrahim Ayub, 14 years old, was not holding any weapon. Israeli sniper shot him in the head. Did he deserve to die?
No one deserves to die.
So why did the Israeli sniper shoot him in the head?
Unless they aim to kill.
He wasn't aiming to kill, so why was he shot in the head?
I'm not sure. If you look at the facts.
What are the facts?
The facts
I mean, there's no transparent investigations. You don't allow any international investigators in, and then you say, trust you, that the nurse had a bomb and a 14-year-old guy was going to kill a sniper.
I do trust the Israeli military. I do trust the Israeli Supreme Court, which is very much trusted by all the world. Israel is transparent. Well, I'm sorry.
That's not what human rights groups in Israel say.
I may say things which may be inconvenient truth.
They're also not true,
but
factually.
I'm here to speak the truth.
Let's go to our panel that we're talking to here in the Oxfordian. Diana Boutou is a Palestinian citizen of Israel, is a human rights lawyer, is a former advisor to the PLO. Would you concede that Hamas does have some responsibility for the way in which it runs Gaza, for the way in which it incites attacks against Israel, for some of the deaths in the Gaza Strip?
Absolutely not. Every choice Israel has made, Israel's always had an opportunity to choose whether to kill these people who are protesting or not to kill them, and they have deliberately chosen to kill them. The idea that somehow we are all linked to Hamas, that somehow because people are linked to Hamas, that they are not human beings, is absolutely ridiculous. He knows very well that the only time that a soldier can shoot is if that soldier himself or herself is under imminent threat. There have been no Israeli soldiers killed or injured. It means that what Israel's doing is deliberately choosing to slaughter Palestinians.
Before I bring back Danny to respond to that. Before I bring back Danny to respond to that.
No way.
Paul Charney is here from the Zionist Federation of the UK, you served in the IDF.
I did.
When you see what's going on in Gaza, when you put yourself in those positions of those Israeli soldiers, do you say, you know what, they shouldn't have pulled the trigger on those kids, they weren't posing an imminent threat, 14-year-old boy's not a threat to me, or do you say, actually, as Danny does, everyone could be a threat?
So as an officer in the IDF, I held myself to the highest regard, and I hope that they held me to the highest regard. No one in the Israeli army has ever had an order to kill civilians. That's never happened. I've never been around to see it. I've never heard it happen. On the other side of it, when Hamas tell Israel that we are here to breach that border and come and kill civilians, we take them in Israel very seriously. That's the one thing you can trust with Hamas. Breaching a border of any country is an act of war. Do not ask Israel not to defend their civilians.
Okay, let's put that point to Avi Schleim. Avi Schleim, prominent British-Israeli historian, former professor here at Oxford University. Avi Schleim, any other country would do what Israel does. Israel has a right to defend itself, is what we hear.
I served in the IDF in the mid-1960s, and I served loyally and proudly because in my time, the IDF was true to its name. It was the Israel Defense Force. But after the June 1967 war, everything changed. Israel became a colonial power, and the IDF became the brutal police force of a brutal colonial power. But there is absolutely no self-defense justification for Israel's brutal policies in Gaza over the last 11 years. a whole series of war crimes were committed, and Israel continued to commit war crimes in Gaza in every successive vicious assault on the people of Gaza, not on Hamas.
Isn't that the problem that Avi points at? That you keep saying, Israel has a right to defend itself, Israeli families have a right to defend itself. But when you look at the numbers over the last 10, 15 years just alone, the ratio is phenomenal. It's like Gazans who are being killed, not Israelis, in their thousands. 500 kids killed in one summer bombardment.
The ratio speaks of the ruthless cruelty of the Hamas leaders.
So you don't take responsibility for any death of any Palestinian civilian because ultimately it's all Hamas's fault, always.
Yes, it is.
That's a great get-out-of-jail-free card.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. I'm not saying that there are no accidents which are deplorable, but the responsibility squarely lies with Hamas.
Danny, I want to ask you this. Israel prides itself on being a democracy, you say, supposedly the only democracy in the Middle East. Yet in recent years, even Israel's own human rights organizations are saying democracy there is under assault from a series of authoritarian, racist, far-right laws.
Israel is a democracy, rule of law. 2 our leaders were thrown into jail. And you know what? It was an Arab Israeli who threw the president of Israel into jail.
When the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, passes the boycott law, which makes any Israeli organization that calls for a boycott against Israel liable to be sued for damages, the Nakba law, which cuts state funding from any organization which marks the country's Independence Day as a day of mourning, the NGO law, which targets quote-unquote foreign-funded human rights organizations. One parliamentarian in Israel called it a semi-fascistic law that harms democracy and is reminiscent of Putin's Russia. That's the Israeli politician speaking.
Of course. Because in Israel, you can say anything and you cannot, what? No one attacks the Israeli government more than Israelis and Israeli newspapers. Israel is a democracy. Anybody can come and go, say and speaks what he wants.
Reuven Rivlin, who's the president of Israel, not a liberal, conservative,
very much,
anti-Palestinian state. He says Israeli society is sick. It is our duty to treat this disease. You don't agree with him either?
I don't agree with that, but I respect
Why are all these people saying it? They all gone mad?
Because they are concerned. They are entitled to their own views.
So you're not concerned about these trends?
No, and they are, listen, they speak subjectively. It doesn't mean that this is the objective situation. It's not that Israel is perfect. No country is.
Let me give you an example of something. Let me give you an example from your time in office. You were in government under Avigdor Lieberman. You were his deputy foreign minister. He was foreign minister. Yeah. He and you wanted to subject Israel's 1.5 million citizens of Palestinian citizens to an oath of loyalty to Israel as a Jewish state, a proposal so controversial, one minister at the time described it as borderline fascist.
Do you know that every American, I don't know how it is here, pledge the loyalty of allegiance every day in school?
Americans don't pledge allegiance to Christianity. They have a separation of church and state.
We do not either.
No, the proposal was you had to support Israel as a Jewish state.
Of course, but Judaism is not only a religion.
Oh, it's
Judaism
a nationality. That's even worse. So you'll be asking people to pledge allegiance to a religion and a race they're not part of. And you're comparing that to the US oath of allegiance.
Is a way of life, is a culture, is a whole civilization, if you will. So there's nothing wrong.
So you supported that policy, which was eventually watered down because it was so controversial.
The country that clothes you and protects you and give you jobs and give you money, including told the Arab Israelis.
Okay, Diana Boutou, you are a Palestinian citizen of Israel. Do you recognize the very rosy picture being painted by Danny Ayalon?
Absolutely not. Look, one thing that he's conveniently overlooking is that Israel describes itself as being a Jewish state, which by its very definition excludes me. And the state is founded on this concept of Jewish privilege, which means that when the Supreme Court, this court that he lauds so much, has faced the question of whether Israel's a Jewish state or a democracy, it has always chosen Jewish state, which means that Jewish privilege exists. And we see this through everything from the 60 laws that directly discriminate against Palestinian citizens of Israel to the way that people such as Ayalon and others deal with Palestinians, for everything from calling for our heads to be chopped off, for us to be drowned, for oaths of loyalty. What they fail to recognize is that we didn't come to Israel, we didn't immigrate to Israel. Israel came to us.
Avi Schlein, many would say you're on the left of the political spectrum. When you look at Israeli society today, do you worry about the trends? Do you share President Rivlin's view that this is a quote-unquote sick society that needs some kind of treatment?
I'm very troubled about the trend in Israeli society. Israel, within its original borders, is a democracy. It's a flawed democracy, but so are all other democracies. But if you look at Israel and the West Bank and Gaza, Israel most emphatically, most decisively is not a democracy. It's an ethnocracy. It's a system in which one ethnic group dominates the others. And there is another word for ethnocracy, and that is apartheid. And this is what Israel is.
Paul Charney, I will come back to you. I'm going to ask you two questions. One is the same question I asked Avi. Are you worried about the trends in Israel? Does that worry you at all? And secondly, do you want to respond to Avi's claim about Israel being an ethnocracy and an apartheid state?
Every democracy around the world has its own unique features. The Israeli democracy and the Israeli nation was built and established because of what happened partially because of what happened in the Holocaust, and therefore a Jewish majority must remain for safety and for security, because we've seen what happens when you rely on the rest of the world for your safety. Number two, anyone else who lives as an Israeli has absolute equal rights. Every Israeli Arab has the same rights of university, of hospitals, of Supreme Court in law.
Diana's shaking her head. She's saying no.
The Knesset has time and again been asked the simple question, is Israel a state that's founded on equality, or is there no equality? And time and again, it will not allow a simple law that calls for equality. And the fundamental problem is that they do not recognize my right to exist. There
Listen,
you go.
have you ever been arrested by Israeli police? Have you ever been beaten by Israeli police? Have you been ever...
Actually, I have.
Tell me about it.
Probably
I still...
probably not the best question to ask the Palestinians.
Yes. I really feel... You can check the bruises. She's all bruised up, right?
Let's just be clear. First, you're saying that if you haven't been beaten by the Israeli police, you're an equal member of society. And then when someone says they have been beaten by Israeli police, you say, where are the bruises?
No, listen.
I'm asking to clarify.
She went to school. Was she denied education? Was she denied social security?
So that's your definition.
What is your definition?
Hold on.
She is Israeli, just like me.
Black Americans during the Jim Crow era could go to school. It doesn't mean that there wasn't massive segregation and discrimination against black Americans.
But there's no...
It's a weird criteria.
No, but Jews and Arabs can go to school together, and they do go to school together.
There were protests on TV just a few weeks ago. Israelis were saying they didn't want to sell a house in their town to a Palestinian family.
And how many Arabs?
That's fine. Did you say that's fine?
Listen.
Did you say that's fine to Israeli people protesting against the sale of a house in their town? Are you okay with that?
They can protest, which is good.
Are you saying it's good, your words, for people to protest against the sale of a house to a Palestinian family to keep the town Jewish only? Because that's what I just said happened, and you said fine, and then you said good. Are you okay with that?
Listen, you have people here and there who I do not believe that they are right. But
so you would condemn those protests. So would you condemn those protests? Because a moment ago you said it's good that they're protesting.
Because it's a democratic society.
But it's a racist protest. You don't have to be okay with the protest.
You can protest whatever you want.
But you condemn those protests.
It's called freedom of expression and speech.
And I'm asking you to give us some free speech. Do you condemn those protests?
I condemn anything which is biased against race, religion, gender.
Do you condemn those protests, Danny? Do you condemn
as such or what they represent?
Whatever you like, Danny. Just do something. Give me an answer.
I condemn any racism.
Okay. General statement. You won't condemn those protests, though.
I would condemn them.
Oh, wow. Okay, we got that. Another one, since you're in a mood of condemnation. Benjamin Netanyahu, you say you don't speak for the government. In 2015, he said during the election campaign, the right-wing government is in danger. Arab voters are coming out in droves to the polls. Surely that was an example of unashamed, naked racism towards a fifth of the population from the Prime Minister of the country.
I would not use this. I would not do that. But you have to understand something else. In democracy, right? In democracy, you do everything you can do in order to win the elections.
That's not what I asked.
And
I mean, racist parties do racist things to win elections. I'm asking you, do you agree it's racist?
It's wrong, but not racist.
We're going to take a break. It's going to continue in part two. We're going to be talking about the Iran deal and Israel's position on Iran and nuclear weapons. We'll be hearing from our very patient audience here in the Oxford Union. Do join us after the break.